finished being written and will be out next year. One of the very first chapters is I talk about boundary conditions. So I think it's always more useful to talk about a higher order concept that will not change. So that's sort of what I call a concept of enduring value.
And particularly how to make sustainability not only a reporting item, but also a strategy item in the discussion.
Yeah. Well, for the most part, many people call me and they have a very specific kind of question in mind about, how do I, make sure I'm in compliance with this regulation or that regulation, or I want to sell carbon credits. How do I sell a carbon credit? And so they get very precise. Inevitably, as I talk to them for a while, I tend to convince them that that's not really their problem. So what I like to do, and actually my next book, which is almost finished being written and will be out next year, one of the very first chapters is I talk about boundary conditions. So I think it's always more useful to talk about a higher order concept that will not change. So that's sort of what I call a concept of enduring value. So the idea of boundary conditions will remain 20 years from now. Specifically, the CSRD, that will evolve. That's today's issue, but in 2 years, it'll be different, and beyond that'll be different. So I can sit here and talk about the new SEC regulations in the United States. China is launching 70 new legislative actions because they're trying to play catch up. So depending on where you're operating, all of this can seem quite confusing. At the same time, it becomes a question of who needs to know what. So you get into an organization, if I'm talking supply chain, well, I'm not talking the CEO anymore, at least not in most organizations. Although, again, that differs. So I used to work a little bit with Mahindra in India. Now, supply chain, if you're an automotive company, is a board level kind of operation. It's very significant because I have 100,000 different parts coming in. So this makes or breaks my organization. But if I'm in a hospital, well, supply chain has been delegated down, and I probably have delegated that to a group purchasing order organization or something like that. It's totally pushed out of the organization. It's not irrelevant, but it's a different place. And again, the question is, who needs to know what? So in Europe, for example, I have very specific certification issues now for products. The CEO is not worried about that, but if I'm a product manager in a consumer product company, I'm very much focused on that. I'm not collecting all the data from my tier 3 or scope 3 emissions data from my suppliers. I'm worried about doing the value chain analysis because that directly maps to the template, and the template is what I have to submit, etc. Or if I'm trying to get my science-based targets agreed to, well, I've got to fill out their template, submit it to them, and wait for them to come back to me. So the way I like to start this is I like to go back and say there's a whole series of information that are decisions. And ultimately, we have to focus organizations on decisions. So even though it's nice to talk about the history of sustainability, and I can talk about the 250 different treaties, conventions, protocols, agreements, amendments that are in force in the environment alone since 1970 that you'll find as part of the UN treaty collection, this will simply make most CEOs' heads explode. That's just not something I don't care about this. I want to know what affects my business tomorrow. So the real issue is, what markets are you doing business in? And right now, although Singapore is a nice country and Thailand is where I live, everything is being driven by 3 markets, right? The European Union, China, and the United States. Why? Because that's 2/3 of global GDP. So no matter who you are in the world, you can be a small company in Malaysia, and you are not required to do scope 3 emissions. In fact, you may not even be required to do any emissions reporting. The fact is, if you're a textile company and your customer is Nike, you have to do scope 3 emissions recording, right? Because Nike needs it. It doesn't matter what your government says. It matters that I'm selling to the United States. That matters. So we've got to start with things like tax and tariffs. How did that affect everyone? We've got to start with the major markets. We've got to start with who are your customers. And we got to build a model of all the different regulations that are potentially relevant and how do they overlap, right? And if you're a really big company, you do a lot of things because it's also politically correct to do it. So I'm also going to do what the Global Reporting Initiative says, right? So I might focus on the CSRD, but I still have to do science-based targets, and I still have to do the Global Reporting Initiative. And even though we've just disbanded the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, all of those are being adopted, and I have to do that. And oh yeah, I sent my senior vice president to the Kunming conference in Montreal, and we've got this task force on nature related disclosures. And now I've got to get my head around biomes and all this other language that all of these politicians are talking about. I'm like, I got to do a what? A biome analysis? So this is getting complex. So the way I like to say is we map out for people a transition path. Step one on the transition path is compliance. So let's make sure you don't get in trouble, because in particular, the EU probably has the most stringent regulations at the moment. So we're going to focus on the EU as the lead, although you may have to do reporting in the United States with the SEC regulations, depending on the size. And like all good regulations, the politicians around the world have not harmonized their definitions. So a reporting company and the size of the company and the revenue, all of these things are different around the world. It's in different currencies and different sort of things. So we worry about harmonizing that a little bit. But in a big company, that says you need a role in finance who does the harmonization for you and does the currency conversions for you. That's not what the CEO is going to worry about. After that, you're worried about doing experiments, right? And again, we've got to remain in compliance. That never changes. This is no different than health and safety or anything else you have to do for compliance. I've got to do it. But I have to understand if I'm going to launch a product, I have to have in mind what are the product requirements? What are the new greenwashing requirements for my marketing department? So I've got to start cascading down and saying, okay, this is not just a senior leadership thing. I got to train finance. I got to train marketing. I got to train human resources on the human rights issues, et cetera, across the organization. And that's really where the complexity is for a big company. And again, without trying to make this sound excessively complicated, if you're a company like, let's say, Johnson & Johnson, the large pharmaceutical, they must have 250 divisions. So every one of those divisions has a different product set, potentially some different vendors, has to write their own compliance reporting, yet I still have to roll it up based on where my headquarters is located, my country of origin. So all of these things matter. And then I layer into that the fact that there are now tariffs and tax issues. And of course, Europe has its cross-border carbon tax initiative, which is a big consideration for anyone in supply chain, because now it affects a decision that maybe we made 20 years ago about where to locate our factory. Now, all of a sudden, you're telling me you're going to increase my prices by 30% because of that decision. That is something that gets CEO attention. And that's a big capital allocation decision. So although, again, things like the CSRD get all the attention, you can map that out and say, okay, this is 2025. This is what happens next year, the year after, all through 2029, when it affects different levels of companies and different kinds of reporting. And again, if I'm operating in China, and I may be, because I may be getting things from them, or I may have vendors in 50 countries, 100 countries all over the world, I have to understand them, not only for the carbon's important, but I also have to understand things for human rights and the treatment of migrant workers and all sorts of other issues. So it gets quite complex. And so the goal, first of all, is to try to simplify a little bit and say, do these 5 things. That's what you need to do.
Actually, you know, you cover the easy part. And why is the easy part? Because we can convert it to numbers. But I would like to turn to the governance part and the social part, which we cannot easily convert to dollars and cents. And I'll
Yeah,
actually turn to Isabella because she's our spokesperson and the engine behind AK5 for questions on ethics and human rights. So there is a whole other discussion if we can take it in that direction with you,
sure.
please.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you for everything Peter you shared. Very practical. I can tell a lot of insights that it's in real time. It's really happening right now. European, China, North America, particularly US, definitely three main guidelines in almost everything, including the artificial development and how to regulate that. And that's part of the sustainable talk as well, because it connects with energy consuming, right? How much electricity we use, which is very practical in environmental perspective. Manuel mentioned you talk about the more practical and easy to measure part of the sustainability. And I agree, almost 90% of the talk right now about sustainability, it's environmental issues. And what about the rest of it? What's your thoughts on this in general?
Well, I thought when we originally developed the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000, and we had 8 goals, I almost thought that was too many. I thought maybe we could narrow this down to 5. And my logic at the time was, so if you have 8 goals and I do well on 6 of them, does that mean I succeeded? And the answer is, well, it depends on which ones you didn't do well on. And so that's really the answer. And the sustainable development goals, of course, you go to 17. And to be honest, it's really not 17. It's really 24. Because several of those goals, like sustainable production and consumption, that's not one goal. Production is different than consumption. So I think politicians got a little tired on a Friday and just grouped some things together to get some quick agreement and moved on. And then afterwards, they said, oh, yeah, by the way, we forgot about things like human rights and governance. So we'll add in those 4 big topics under the UN Global Compact, which really are goals. Part of the problem with having 24 goals is that no one knows what they are. Even, well-meaning people. That's a lot to internalize. And even fewer people, in my experience, have really read any of these documents. Now, as an exercise, I do this with some companies. I point out that if you really were to read, the 4 major treaties under the UN Global Compact, and if you were to read all the IPCC reports, and you were to read the major treaties, you'd have to read about 70,000 pages. Now, the easy answer is nobody read the 70,000 pages. It's not a practical understanding. So I try to shrink this back for people and say, yes, as a business leader, your primary focus is finding competitive advantage in sustainability. I'll leave aside the issue of things like degrowth and whether or not we can sustain 9 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion people on planet Earth. I'll push that aside for a second. I'm just saying, at the moment, if you're going to solve certain issues, you need to solve for competitive issues and sustainability. I also say to people that although there are 17 sustainable development goals, the fact is we do have to focus on 3 faster than the others. And that's climate action, life on land, and life underwater, 13, 14, and 15. Now, that's not saying that poverty is not important, or that gender equity is not important, or any of the others are not important. However, if we don't solve those 3, in my opinion, everything else gets worse, right? If you don't solve climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a harvest that's missed, you will drive up poverty rates. In many of these countries, when you drive up poverty rates, gender equity gets worse. Justice gets worse. Many other things, conflicts get worse. You also drive migration because people vote with their feet. An awful lot of the world's agriculture, 35%, is done by small holding farmers. Those small holding farmers are generally managing crops on something like 2 to 4 acres of land. They don't have the capital to survive a bad harvest. Nevertheless, 2 bad harvests or a drought that lasts 5 years. So all of these things really do come down to those big three. Now, having said that, I do say to people, your goal is create competitive advantage. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to create long-term multi-capital value. And multi-capital value says there are 6 types of value, right? And that's a hard one for people to come around because social value, relationship capital, we just are not very mature in describing this. And one of the problems with this idea of understanding natural capital and things like that is very often this is delegated to the people in finance. Now, the people in finance have been working on numbers and financial numbers for the last several hundred years. And now you turn around and say, okay, give me an idea on how to value improving the communities where we live and work. They're struggling with this issue. Nevertheless, they have to start creating experiments and they have to start partnering with companies. And partnerships are one of the key things that people have to do. They also have to focus on eliminating social and environmental negatives immediately in their business. Right? And again, that's something practical they can focus on. Because if I can describe it to them saying, no, I'm sorry, that is a social negative as defined by various organizations, and there's plenty of organizations who are creating test metrics for this. So you can. So you've got to find sustainable competitive advantage. You've got to create long-term multi-capital advantage. You've got to eliminate social and environmental negatives. Now comes the hard part. And the hard part says, I also want you to help regenerate natural and social systems because we've created a lot of negatives, particularly in the post-World War II era, the last 70 years. And again, those can be described. But this is where you get into conflict around the world. You don't necessarily have conflict with a lot of social issues in Europe, as an example, because Europe is a much more collaborative set of cultures. But when you get into different areas of the world, and I'm not going to mention specific areas, things like unionization, the right to work, a free press, gender equity, the role of men and women, access to education. There's a lot more dispute about that on a cultural basis. That's going to take a lot of work. And I don't think it's an accident that some of these issues, like simply like the right of women to vote, that's been worked on for centuries, right? So the idea that we're going to solve everything by 2030, I don't think ever was a legitimate target. It's aspirational, absolutely, and we should not set it aside. So the final thing I say to people, right? Competitive advantage, multi-capital, eliminate social and environmental negatives, help regenerate what we've destroyed. But then it's about, you've got to engage in cooperative behavior with a goal of mutual gain. And that's a mental model shift for people. The idea of long-term mutual gain and cooperative behavior. One of the toughest SDGs to get anyone to focus on is SDG 17, where we're all supposed to share and work together and collaborate. Now, that's a tough one. And you can easily make the argument that the SDGs are all about ethics, 100%, right? The idea of climate justice, all about moral and ethical frameworks and the simple concept of doing the right thing. The challenge we've put before businesses is you've got to somehow maintain your revenue, maintain your profitability, do all this reporting, which is documented in 70,000 words by your friends in government, and do the right thing for the communities where we live and work. That's a hard job. And so I have a lot of sympathy for those people. And I have a lot of sympathy for a startup that, to be honest, is probably worried much more about making their payroll on Thursday than they are about whether or not everything is meeting their climate justice goals. That's just practical. Um, so again, my approach to this is simplify it down and said, how would I internalize in your organization ethics within the concept of innovation? What changes and what can we bring to bear? And how do we balance these immature knowledge domains with the pull of these things that we really know how to do well? And that's where all the focus is, because I know how to do that. These other ones are going to take a lot more work. And to be honest, if we get to 2030 and we grow the goals to 52 sustainable goals, because everybody has thrown in their favorite idea, it will sink the project. There's too much on the table. And I don't think anyone can legitimately focus on doing 17 goals and remembering that there's 169 submeasures and all the various things that are embedded in human rights. It's quite a complex issue. So again, one of the chapters of my book is about partnerships, memberships, and the idea of third-party opinions. You have to have a good sounding board who can come in and say, all your plans are great, but you have not thought of this correctly. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect people to think of all these things themselves. I think they need someone like you, Isabel, to come in and say, have you thought of this? No, yeah, it's always priority number 12. You've got to move it up a little bit on the priority list. But it's hard to do, and I suspect we will have to keep reminding people and working on this for the rest of my natural life.
Hi. Please go ahead, Isabel.
Oh, no, go ahead, Manuel, please.
I'm watching you both in the dialogue, and it's amazing because Isabella is also a book author. She has already one book to her credit, a bestseller about the future, and watching this dynamic between past, present, future. It's amazing for me. I get a full lecture, just listening to you guys, and it's fantastic. Isabella's book, it's about the digital mind, how we move to these digital technologies and innovations that you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, Peter. And that's it's an overused term. It's top of the mind because everything seems to be top of the mind. So I'm not sure how much space we have in our minds for top of the minds. But moving on, I think you raised very well the ethics, that is the linchpin, is the connection between the all these United Nations SDG, the goals linking, as you mentioned, 17. You scared me when you said they may end up to be 52 or some number like that. But I'm going to go back to Isabella to see how, and together maybe you pierce a little bit the future for me and see how we train the people, how we get the people to act in that space.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. When you were talking, I keep thinking, I think you're talking about change management, and also even a little bit systematic change about our thinking or how do we organize people. And it's definitely not easy. And I even thought about if there's even conflict to do these things at the same time. But we don't have time to elaborate on that. But you definitely mentioned many great points, and also I can see you're offering solutions through your book and also through working with people. To wrap up everything we kind of mentioned today, what would you be the advice that you give to people that it's working on this, and especially younger generations? I see they have this innate desire and ability to understand the concept that you mentioned, how to switch our mentality to get on this journey. It's very inspiring. So what would you be advise them if you're coaching them today?
Well, I like to keep things simple. I think if I were to sit here and make 22 points of advice, no one would follow it because they would never remember it. So I think one of the first things I always tell people is sustainability. And again, a lot of these other issues are low maturity knowledge domains. Simply means we haven't figured it out yet. So you have to be a consumer of information. All right. It's one of the best things you can do. And unfortunately, college degrees and things are still stuck back in an era 600 or 800 years ago when everyone could master a certain domain. And then that's why you were a master or you were a doctor. You sort of conquered this and there wasn't much left to conquer. Well, today there is. So your degree really is just about giving you some basic training on how to think. So one, you have to accept accountability for the challenges that are out there, right? And accepting accountability says you're part of the solution. So that's what I say. You have to be focused on continuous learning. It's a lifelong path. So if you're going to do that, get involved in purpose-based work. Get involved in something where when you get up in the morning, you're excited to go do it. There are professions out there that, as far as I'm concerned, I would be bored out of my mind if I had to do them every day. So I'm glad I don't have to do it. To me, my motivation when I go to talk to someone is I'm trying to convince these people in the room to go out and make a difference. And if I can do that, then I feel I'm leaving a legacy for the next generation. There's an old series of proverbs. One of the things I covered in my first book was the idea of looking to ancient civilizations for lessons about how some long-lived societies managed to survive so long. And there was in Native American tribes an old tradition called the seventh generation tradition, where when you sat down to make a big decision, you'd say, how does that decision affect me and my group? But then you would ask, how does it affect my children's generation? My children's generation. You'd go forth 7 generations. And those sort of processes take accountability to the next level. So for everybody, if you say, listen, assume accountability, be a continuous learner, find purpose-based work, try to make an impact, and really think about the legacy, even though you're just starting your career, about the legacy that you're going to leave. And hopefully it is that you leave a better world than the one you came into at the beginning of your career. And if you can do all those things and make some money at the same time, more power to you. You've done a lot, and you should be proud of yourself. But I don't find it difficult to get younger people, engaged in the issue of sustainability. They get it. The people sitting on the fence tend to be older folks who are yearning for some period of time that never really existed or something like that. I often start my conversations by pointing out to people today that by 2050, and I hope I'm still alive and I hope I'm still chatting with Manuel. It's another 25 years. Hopefully we'll be there. I'm sure, Isabella, you'll be around doing great things. But over the next 25 years or so, we're going to add $100 trillion in global GDP. Right? We're only about 105 trillion now, according to the World Bank. So we're going to double. And that is the best representation of consumption and production that there is. So we're going to double consumption and production while we add 1.5 billion more people to planet Earth. So when I ask people to be accountable, I'm saying that's what you have to be accountable for. Because by the time we get to 2050, we've got to have some really good solutions in place. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough place to live. But it doesn't have to be. And that's up to us. So that go forth and do the right thing. which is the ethical standard.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. The powerful message to the younger generations and to everyone that is hold accountability to the society to the 2050, right? For all of us. Thank you for taking the time, sharing your insights. At this late hours of the day, you are doing great things already. And thank you for our audience for joining us. Make sure you tune in every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talk series, where you can gain new perspective on how to mitigate risk and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation. Until next week, goodbye for now. Bye, Peter. Bye, Manuel.
Bye bye.
Take care.
And thank you, Peter. Thank you, Isabella.
No problem.